times, came up with the rules of ritual themselves. I mean, they work, they're valuable, but they're not the product of revelation. They don't come from God or from heaven. Xunzi actually takes a rather secular approach to life. He says heaven is just nature. Okay, the Chinese word tian literally means sky. Okay, it's just the sky. It functions in a mechanical fashion with no concern for human society or for human values. Natural disasters, he says, are not messages from the other side. They're not portents. They're not warnings, as in mandate of heaven theories. They're simply natural phenomena. And Xunzi kind of makes sense in an age of science. I mean, he would see eclipses and earthquakes as just being part of the way the world works. In his essay on heaven, so this is part of his book called the Xunzi, he makes the following sorts of observations. He says, heaven doesn't suspend winter just because people don't like the cold. Don't worry about eclipses or comets or trees that make strange sounds in the night. And, people say, oh, what does that mean? He said, it doesn't mean anything. It's just the transformations of yin and yang. And notice that even Confucians talk in terms of yin and yang by this point. This is after the 100 schools and things are getting mixed up and people are debating each other in the Dao Hotel. Rather than heavenly portents, it's human portents that matter. Okay, what are human portents? He says, when you're traveling around and you see fields that have been abandoned, that are untended, when there are high prices for basic commodities, when people are starving, when there are bodies on the roadside, then you know that things are going wrong. Those are human portents. I love what Xunzi says about natural disasters. He says, if the government is good, if the rulers are practicing the way, if they're looking after the people, even if there are floods and droughts, people won't go hungry. But if the government is corrupt and oppressive, even if there are no floods and droughts, people will still suffer and they'll still starve. I mean, ultimately, the worst disasters are man-made. It's how people react to what comes just mechanically by nature through natural processes. So rituals are important. Actually, they're crucial in fostering goodness. And they also provide psychological satisfaction, but they don't influence the workings of the cosmos. Xunzi notes that when people pray for rain, it rains sometimes. Why is that? And he says, well, actually, it'll always rain eventually, whether people pray or not. Rulers can participate in ceremonies and sacrifices, but whereas the people believe in them superstitiously, rulers know that the most important function of such rituals is to promote harmony and order. For example, sacrifices to the ancestors give expression to feelings of remembrance and longing for the dead. Expectations of supernatural intervention by departed loved ones are rather beside the point. It's like I have a friend who's an atheist who believes in the power of prayer. And I remember asking him, saying, you don't even believe there's a God. Like, why do you pray? That doesn't make any sense. And he said, well, actually, there's something about prayer where you sit in a calm place, you focus on particular things, and when you do that, that sort of concentration sometimes leads to ideas that you haven't had before. So I think you can get answers to prayer, even though I don't think they come from God at all. Okay, compare that to Xunzi talking about the rituals. He says, the gentlemen understand them as the human way. The common people think of them as matters having to do with spirits. Let me talk for just a minute about ancestor worship. When your parents die, you're still connected to them. You still have the same relationship. But it's not like they've gone into a completely transcendent realm. It's more like they've moved away, far away, let's say to Indonesia. They're never coming back. You're not going to see them again. But you can still send care packages. You can send letters. This is prayers and ceremonies and sacrifices you can make actually to feed the ancestors who might be hungry on the other side. And in return, they might pull some strings on your behalf and help you out, sort of the way they did when they were alive, to make your life better in some ways. Now, you worship 3 degrees of ancestors. So your parents, actually this is all on your father's side. So it has to be your parents and then your father's parents, your paternal grandparents, and then paternal great-grandparents. And just 3 levels of ancestor worship for ordinary sorts of people. When Christian missionaries, Jesuits, came into China originally. They looked at what was going on with ancestor worship, and they said, what are we going to do about this? Is it idolatry or not? And the Jesuits said, it's actually just respect. It's a very high degree of respect, but it's just honoring your father and your mother. Later on, there were Dominicans who came in who said, no, this is idolatry. I mean, if we're not going to put up with Protestant Christianity, why should we put up with Confucian Christianity? The issue got debated back in Rome. The Pope came down on the side of the Dominicans and said ancestor worship is inappropriate for Chinese Christians, which actually is going to pretty much end Christianity in China. It just pulls people too far out of civilized society, the way that the Chinese had defined it. Eventually, the emperor himself sided with the Jesuits and said, I'm not going to accept any Dominicans, and who is this guy in Italy who's telling my people what they can and can't believe? And Christianity just sort of falters in China over the issue of ancestor worship. Okay, back to Mencius early on. If Mencius gets credit for early economic thinking, we can recognize Xunzi as one of the first environmentalist philosophers. He urges rulers to adopt laws that conserve grasses and trees, fish and turtles, so that they can remain abundant. For example, he suggests that mountain forests should not be cut down when they're flowering or putting forth new shoots. And he wants nets and poisons prohibited from marshes during times when fish and turtles are depositing their eggs. He says, so as not to cut short their life and not to break their growth. And finally, language is also a rather arbitrary human construct, according to Xunzi, so words should be used precisely. And Xunzi talks about the rectification of names, which is basically matching names to reality, particularly in government offices, where you want to make sure that the person doing the office has the right title and the right description of what his responsibilities are. Xunzi's philosophy is very carefully articulated, and it's very readable. Okay, where does all of this go from here? Mencius and Xunzi, as followers of Confucius, have been compared to Plato and Aristotle, who were followers of Socrates. They have a lot in common. Both of these thinkers like education. They think that people can become sages. They like moral government and ritual. But Mencius tends to be more idealistic, and Xunzi more natural, maybe more realistic. Sort of like Plato is oftentimes thought of as more idealistic and Aristotle more down to earth. Xunzi's unsentimental realism was probably a better fit for the Warring States era, right? A time of great violence and chaos. And he was probably more influential in early China. Yet Mencius's ideas eventually overshadowed those of Xunzi. Why is that? It may be that Chinese culture is basically optimistic. They like the idea that people are naturally good. Xunzi was more open to the role of laws in statecraft, and some of his students were associated with legalism, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. And consequently, Xunzi's reputation suffered when the legalist Qing dynasty was taken over and repudiated by its successor, the Han dynasty. People blame all those bad things on legalists. In the 12th century, the writings of Mencius, actually the book of Mencius, is going to be included in the 4 books, along with the Analects and then 2 chapters from the Book of Rites. This collection became the fundamental text of Neo-Confucianism. We'll see that in Lecture 23. And those 4 books will be the subject matter for the imperial civil service exams for about 700 years. The prominence of Mencius in Chinese thought is the reason why he and Confucius are the only 2 Chinese philosophers who are known in English by Latinized names, because they were first introduced to the West by Jesuit missionaries writing in Latin in the 17th century. So Confucius, that I-U-S, and Mencius, I-U-S. In Chinese, it's Kongzi, there's that zi that means master, and Mengzi. In popular culture, Chinese is a challenging language, and so you have to learn a lot of words, but also some 4-character phrases, some slogans. And Chinese always are putting these little phrases into their discussion. The closest thing I can think of in English is maybe something like monkey see, monkey do, which would be hard to understand if you weren't a native English speaker, but if you have heard that phrase, you know what it means. Mencius writes fairly clear, straightforward Chinese. It's a good place to start learning classical Chinese, and he includes some memorable stories and illustrations. For example, a man from the state of Song was impatient for seedlings to grow, and he went out and pulled them up a bit to help them out. He went home, his sons, and he said, I'm tired, I'm just exhausted. His son said, what have you been doing? He said, I've been helping seedlings to grow. Okay, his son went out to the field to see what was going on, and already everything had started withering. Mencius says you can't force self-cultivation. And there's this 4-character phrase, ba miao zhu jiang, that means pulling at the sprouts to help them grow. Okay, people hear that and they know, oh yeah, that means you can't rush a natural process, otherwise you'll ruin things in the attempt. Okay, 2 more very quickly that you've already heard about. For hopeless, wrong-headed actions, somebody Chinese may say, yuan mu, chou yu. It's like climbing a tree to look for a fish. Remember the king that Mencius was talking to who tried to gain the empire by violence. And finally, in China, a wise mother is devoted to her children's education. And that sort of thing might elicit the comment, Meng mu san qian. Mencius's mother moved 3 times. Okay. What a lovely example of how mothers sometimes can cultivate and nurture their children and set an example. And perhaps that's a good place to end here with the question, what are you willing to do for your children?